If you haven't been reading all along, Isaiah will be a little more difficult in terms of time, so I thank you very much for your reading. Now then, this is what Hosea says about Israel and then about Gomer, his wife. Now then, I will block up her path with a thorn hedge and bar the road against her till she cannot find her way. She will pursue her lovers and miss them, seek them and never find them. Then at last she will say, let me go back to my first husband. I fared better with him than today. Another excerpt, I will make the dale of trouble a door of hope. Isn't that a good line? I will make the dale of trouble a door of hope. Another, Ephraim allows himself to be mixed up with foreigners. And then this choice piece of imagery. Ephraim has become a cake unturned. Can't you get the figure? Done on the outside, raw on the inside. Oh, it's wonderful. Foreigners eat away his strength, unknown to him, yet they will not return to their God. Another, they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. You've heard that one, haven't you? Even though you haven't read Hosea. No stalk in their shoot. It bears no fruit. If fruit is bare, if fruit is born, a foreigner would devour it. And then this, a prophet is a crazy fool. A man inspired is a man insane. The prophet is God's watchman. Another, because you relied on your chariots, on your hosts of war horses, in your towns shall tumults rise, and all your forts be crushed. I drove them with a harness of love. Isn't it wonderful? But my people are now weary of revolting. They cry to me, Ephraim, how can I give you up? Israel, how can I let you go? I will not execute my anger. I will not ruin Ephraim again, for I am God, not man. Thus I who shepherded you in the desert, in that houseless land, you fed and filled yourselves and grew proud and forgot me. Come back to your God, O Israel, for your faults have made you fall. I will be like dew to Israel. He shall blossom like a lily and strike roots down like a poplar. Is that an interesting imagery? He will blossom like a lily, but his roots will be strong like a poplar. Combination of goodness and innocence. Very interesting. His branches shall spread out, his leaves fresh as an olive's, his scent like the scent of incense. Once more shall they live under my shadow, well watered as a garden, flourishing like a vine, and fragrant as Lebanon's wine. Now, Hosea is the second of the writing prophets, as we pointed out last Sunday. Unlike Amos, Hosea was a peasant. He was rural. He was, as it were, a dirt man. Sensitive, poetic, gripped by one terrifying passion. And that was that Israel belonged to God and God belonged to Israel. His concern is with the apostasy of Israel in the way in which Israel had taken up idolatrous worship. He's not particularly concerned, as Amos was, with righteousness, with the way the impersonal city dweller, the businessman, the traffic of city life tended to cause men to build power and securities for themselves in a secondary and tertiary manner, being cut off from having a face-to-face contact with the misery that their operations had precipitated. We find nothing in him that says, let justice roll down like a river. He isn't concerned with social justice as such, but he is concerned with personal piety and the way in which that piety makes it possible for an individual to live a life worthy of God. His story is a very tragic one in some ways. He married a lady whose name was Gomer. She was the daughter of a man who was one of the leaders of the Baal cult. And their first child was born, and he said, the name of this child shall be Jezreel, for it is in the valley of Jezreel that Jehovah will wreak his vengeance upon Israel for violating the covenant and failing to be true to him. And then it seems as if his wife became barren. And the pattern of life in which she had lived, the cultus and the religious experience, which was a part of her history and development in the time of her crisis, came to her rescue. It's very interesting how the things that loom in their significance in times of crisis usually are the things that have been an intimate part of the process of your living. It's very interesting. And the things that you study and so forth will make a kind of veneer, and you move on that level. But when the pressures begin to close in on you, the thing that you reach for is the thing that is the deepest part of your experience. The thing that has been the longest sustained part of your experience. I remember when I was in divinity school, one of my very close friends was a Japanese classmate, and he spoke English beautifully. And I shall always remember that when he preached his senior sermon, and we were all listening, suddenly he began talking about something that plowed way down in him, and without ever realizing it, he began preaching in Japanese. Just like that. So, when Gomer wanted another child and she couldn't have one, the behavior pattern with which she was familiar came to the rescue. So what did she do? She went to the temple of Baal. And there, in that ceremonial, the significance of which we do not quite understand at this far distance, but out of our conceit we've called it temple prostitution, she conceived. It's very interesting, isn't it? I don't want to get off on that aside, but it's interesting. I remember standing outside the Galagat Temple in Bombay, either Bombay or Calcutta, one of them. Calcutta, I guess. Anyway, one of them. And it's a temple, the only Hindu temple in which there is animal sacrifice. And hard by this temple, there's a thorn tree. And the thorn tree has tied on it all sorts of offerings. And I stood there watching one day. And I saw a little Hindu lady with trembling devotion take from out of her sari a little precious package. And then, with some words that I did not understand, she tied that package to the thorn tree as her offering, hoping that the God that controls all of the processes of life, including the opening of the womb, would be merciful to her and let her have a child that she might keep her husband. And that's what Gomer did. That's what she did. We can understand that. So this child that was born after that was given a certain name by the prophet, and then another child was born under the same circumstances. But all that was deepest in Hosea also came to the rescue of Hosea in his crisis. And what was deepest in Hosea? That God, Jehovah, was the only true God. And that Israel had had a private, primary covenant with Jehovah. And that any flirtation with other gods, other cults, whatever may be the nature of the extremity that drives a man, any flirtation with any god other than Israel is idolatry, is violation of the love of God and the covenant. And therefore, what Gomer had done was to put a Baal cult over against the worship of Yahweh, and to draw on the vitality of that cult to fertilize her body and add shame to Israel. And she became a harlot, an outcast in the love of her husband, and he could not forgive her, not merely because she had borne other men's children, but because she had dared Baal could do for her what Jehovah couldn't do. And if she's right, reasoned the prophet, if she is right, then the nerve center of my consent is paralyzed. If Gomer is right about Baal, then I am wrong about Jehovah. And if I'm wrong about Jehovah, then all of the meaning of life, all of the fateful significance of the covenant, all of the magic and mystery and beauty of the brooding Yahweh over the fluctuating Israelites means nothing. And so it was an issue on which turned the very fate of a religious faith. There it is. Then, whether it was a rationalization, I suppose some modern students of psychology would have say a lot of interesting things about why he said this or that, but that is beside the point. He tried to reduce his problem to a manageable unit. And I'll get to the heart of it in just a minute. How can this problem, this great problem I have, make sense? And that's what we're always trying to do, isn't it? See, you don't, if you can, whatever your problem may be, however great your tragedy may be, if you can somehow pull it down to size, you can take care of it. But if you can't pull it down to size and it romps all over you, then it may actually dethrone your reason. But however terrible it is, if you can somehow reduce it to a manageable unit, then you can ride it rather than having it ride you. And that's what he was trying to do. How can I manage this? How can I think about it in a way that will keep me from being destroyed by it? Ah, said he. I'm being taught something about Israel in this. Look at Israel. She has behaved the very way Gomer has behaved. And what has God done? What has Jehovah done? Well, Jehovah is hurt, just as I'm hurt. And when he felt, you see, that Jehovah was hurt as he was hurt, and for fundamentally the same reason, then that softened his hurt. Because Jehovah's shoulders were broader than his. And if somehow he could shift a little of it over to Jehovah, then that's one way by which he could reduce it to a manageable unit. And of course that is at once the secret of the confessional, isn't it? It's very interesting. So he says that Jehovah looks upon Israel with the same sort of first anger, disgust, disdain, and then pity, then compassion, because Jehovah loves Israel. And because Jehovah loves Israel, he can never let Israel go. Well, that's what he said. Because he loves Israel, he will not let Israel get altogether out of his hands. But how can he keep Israel without condoning what Israel has done? That's his problem, you see. So he says, go back Jehovah says to Hosea, go back and get the lady. Take her from her misery and her sin. Re-establish her in your household. Reduce all of her exposures to other human beings to zero. And in the long quiet, let your love have a chance to work its way. Don't give up. How can I do that, said the prophet. I'll be held up to ridicule and embarrassment and humiliation. But this is what you must do, because this is what Jehovah is doing with Israel. Then out of the depths of his own struggling and the new and abiding insights that have been generated in his mind and spirit, he looks now for the first time, really, out upon Israel. And he goes from the little town into the city. And in the city, his little peasant soul was simply blasted. Of course, in the little town, where there wasn't anything else to do and the pressures were intimate and primary pressures, he could understand why the people would be worshipers of Baal. It was a fertility cult. But in the city, the sophisticated place where they were exposed to books and knowledge and all those things, in the city, of course he would not expect to find it. And there in the city, he found everything. Not only did he find Baal worship, but he found that the leaders of the people, the priests, the politicians, the statesmen, all the guides of the social forces that determined the life of the people and defined the significance of that life, that these people were at their very heart corrupt, full of panic and fear, because they had drifted far away from the security, the emotional and the political and the intellectual security that came from the awareness that they were Yahweh's people and they were worshiping Yahweh and being true to Yahweh. When they separated from Yahweh and a part of the social process itself became this radical departure from the genius of Israel, then they floundered. They were people without a spiritual home. They were people without any sense of security. And what happened to them? They lost their nerve. And when they lost their nerves, then they began doing all sorts of things. And one of the things that they did was to try to let political alliances become a substitute for depending upon Jehovah. Assyria, Egypt, running, knocking at every door. We can't stand alone in the presence of the menacing forces that surround us. We must have help. And the only way that we can get the help is to make these alliances, and we can establish out of our own security, our money, that sort of thing, we can make it worthwhile to these other peoples to join with us against the common enemy. What does that sound like? What does that sound like to you? What does it sound like? What does it sound like? And because so much emphasis, says Hosea now, this is way back, you see, BC. Because of this emphasis upon the foreign alliances, Hosea says that all sorts of confusion, chaos, and upheaval turned up at home. Interesting. Because it's said to the masses of the people that there was no longer any confidence in the genius of the people themselves and the religious and political doctrine out of which Israel was born. And if the leaders of Israel have no confidence in that, but must project their fears beyond their borders and hope to guarantee their security by these external alliances, then what happens to the little man who can only depend upon his job or his neighbor or his friend? The fundamental confusion of the prime movers of the state and the church cuts the ground from under the simple man who has nothing to depend upon in his environment but the stabilities of that environment guaranteed by those who hold in their hands the social process. And if they don't have any faith, then we are bankrupt. So, Hosea says, won't you come back to first principles? It's an old story. It's as old as life. Won't you try to recover the lost radiance of a former commitment to God? And then he gets angry again, and his mind just moves up and down like that. One time, crying out against all of this apostasy. And then another time, saying, oh, how God loves Israel. God will not take his hand off Israel. And finally, that shuttling back and forth between these two poles of emotion. At last, he says, I see now how to reconcile my problem. God will not let Israel go, and yet God cannot condone Israel's sin. If he keeps Israel, does it mean that he condones Israel's sin? No. 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 Perhaps the purpose of the suffering, of the punishment, is to redeem Israel and make it possible for Israel to win the right to be in the covenant. And out of Hosea then comes the great doctrine that love has a heart that is as warm as fire, but it works often in conjunction with a brain that is as cold as ice. punishment for sin. The righteous God can't withhold that. It's a part of the moral order. But God can keep his hands on you and not let you go while the logic, the relentless logic of the operation of antecedent and consequence works its way out in your life. Now that's it. That's it. Do you see what he's saying? Do you see? And what it means for us. Have you said over and over again as you contemplated the present moment in human history that God must be evil to keep the world full of war? Have you thought that? It's the same problem that Hosea had. If life in Western civilization had unfolded in a manner, please hear what I'm going to say, and I'm almost through now. If life in Western civilization, as it has been for the past 100 years, 125 years, if that life had not yielded, world wars, there would be no integrity in the moral process itself. Wars do not spring full grown like Minerva from the head of Zeus. Wars are the unfolding logic, the relentless movement of social processes that end in that kind of disaster. And if that were not true, we could have no confidence in the morality of life. But that does not mean that God is outside of it. But to me, the logic of history is that God is in history, guaranteeing the relentless movement, the pulse beat, the swinging of antecedent and consequence, of reaping and sowing inherent in the process. No. That being the fact, as I think it is, it is my hope, my simple hope, that we will discover, even in the midst of the carnage and the results of our own behavior, some margin of wisdom that will be deep within our social process, the symbol that God has not taken his hands off, not only off of America, on this planet. For if something happens to us, my friends, that destroys within us the faith that is as deep as life, that the ultimate destiny of man is a good destiny, if that is destroyed in us, then all of life, whatever may be our position in it, will be but a grinning skull and crossbones. But with that faith, we can work, struggle, and anticipate the redemptive process of the Spirit and the will of God.